Perry Stone just dropped a bombshell about Joni Lamb that no one saw coming. In an explosive revelation, he uncovered shocking truths that could change everything you thought you knew about the Daystar network. His words are stirring up controversy and causing a media frenzy. You won't believe what he said. This is a game changer. Stay tuned to hear the full story. You don't want to miss this shocking confession. Joni Lamb's rise to leadership within Daystar was both a natural progression and a surprising shift in the dynamics of the Christian media world. Initially known for her role as a supportive partner alongside her late husband Marcus Lamb, Joni was a quiet but integral presence in the ministry they built together. Marcus was the public face of Daystar, and for many, Joni was seen as the behind-the-scenes partner who helped with the organization and day-to-day operations. However, after Marcus's sudden passing, Joni's path to leadership became inevitable. When Marcus passed away unexpectedly, the Daystar network, which they had grown into one of the largest Christian television stations in the world, was left without its guiding force. The transition of leadership within the organization wasn't easy. Joni, who had been largely seen as the supportive spouse, now had to step into the spotlight. She had been involved in Daystar from its early days, but as the foundation of the ministry began to shift, so did her role. What seemed like a sudden change to many was in fact a culmination of years of experience and a deep personal connection to the mission of Daystar. Joni was not unfamiliar with the challenges of running a large-scale ministry. She had worked tirelessly with Marcus to build Daystar's foundation, but now she found herself having to navigate the complexities of leadership without him. Despite the personal grief she faced, she stepped up with an incredible determination to maintain and grow the ministry Marcus had started. This period marked the beginning of a new era for Daystar, one where Joni would redefine her role and assert her influence over the network. Her transition wasn't entirely smooth, however. Many had expected Marcus's son Jonathan Lamb to step into his father's shoes, but the reality was more complicated. Jonathan had been groomed for leadership for years, working side by side with Marcus and learning the ins and outs of the ministry. But Joni's rapid rise in power shifted the dynamics, and some of the family members and longtime supporters felt the change was too abrupt. Joni's leadership style evolved quickly. Initially seen as a compassionate and collaborative figure, she began to take more control over decisions, sometimes without consulting the rest of the family. This newfound authority wasn't just about running Daystar. It was about preserving the legacy of the ministry while also guiding it into a new era. She centralized decision-making power, reshaping the direction of the network, and became more publicly visible, a figurehead who spoke on behalf of Daystar's mission. This shift brought about both praise and criticism. On one hand, many admired her resolve and ability to keep Daystar afloat during a time of personal loss. On the other hand, her increasingly authoritative approach raised eyebrows among those who had once viewed her as a collaborative partner. The tension within the family, particularly with Jonathan, became more pronounced as Joni's leadership expanded. Despite the controversies, Joni's leadership ultimately helped Daystar continue to grow and remain relevant in the Christian broadcasting space. Her rise to power was marked by both challenges and triumphs, as she balanced grief, family dynamics, and the responsibility of leading one of the most influential Christian media networks in the world. Doug Weiss's rapid ascent within Daystar TV was a fascinating and somewhat controversial development, especially given his relatively low profile before marrying Joni Lamb. For years, Doug had been a well-respected Christian marriage counselor and therapist, but he had never been known for his public presence or his involvement in the high-powered world of Christian media. That all changed when he married Joni Lamb, the widow of Marcus Lamb, Daystar's founder, and quickly became an influential figure within the ministry. Doug's initial role in Daystar was relatively understated. He was introduced to the public mostly as a marriage counselor with a focus on relationships, healing, and emotional well-being. His content was generally well received, especially by those seeking advice on marriage and family issues from a Christian perspective. He was known for his calm demeanor and compassionate approach to helping others. But what really turned heads was how quickly Doug's influence grew after his marriage to Joni. It wasn't long after Marcus Lamb's death that Doug began to play a more significant role within the network. While Joni had always been involved with Daystar in the background, it was her sudden assumption of the leadership role that set the stage for Doug's rise. His presence on the network's programming increased almost overnight. Where there once had been primarily preaching, worship, and traditional Christian programming, Daystar now began to include more counseling and therapeutic content, which aligned with Doug's areas of expertise. The changes within the programming were noticed almost immediately by Daystar's longtime viewers. Some welcomed the shift, appreciating Doug's expertise and the practical approach he brought to relationship and emotional issues, Others, however, saw the changes as a departure from the original spiritual mission of Daystar. There was a noticeable pivot in content, which some critics saw as a move away from the gospel-centered message that Daystar had been built on. Instead, the network was starting to resemble more of a self-help platform, where emotional healing and relationship advice took center stage. What raised eyebrows even further was Doug's newfound position of power within Daystar. While he was not a direct member of the Lamb family by blood, his close relationship with Joni and their quick marriage elevated him into an authoritative role. It wasn't just that Doug was seen as an advisor on relationship matters. He became a key player in the network's leadership, making decisions about what content would air, which ministers and speakers would be featured, and how Daystar would move forward in terms of its vision and mission. For many longtime followers of the network, this rapid ascent was unsettling. Some felt that Doug's rise had less to do with his abilities or merits, and more to do with his marriage to Joni. There was a perception that he had used his relationship with her to secure power and influence within the ministry, sidelining other potential leaders within the network. Doug's immediate involvement in Daystar's decision-making process raised questions about his motivation. Was his leadership about advancing the ministry's mission, or was it about consolidating power within the Lamb family, particularly in the wake of Marcus's untimely passing? Meanwhile, inside the network, there were growing tensions. Joni had already taken the reins of Daystar, but as Doug's role expanded, it seemed that the decision-making was becoming more centralized, with Joni and Doug at the helm. This shift in power dynamics created rifts, particularly with Joni's son, Jonathan Lamb. Jonathan had been groomed to take over the leadership of Daystar after Marcus's death. He had worked alongside his father for years, learning the ropes and gaining experience in the day-to-day operations of the network. But as Joni and Doug's influence grew, Jonathan felt increasingly sidelined. Jonathan's frustration with being excluded from important decisions within the ministry became public over time. He voiced concerns about the direction of Daystar under Joni and Doug's leadership. He argued that the ministry was losing sight of the vision that Marcus and Joni had built together. Jonathan felt that his role, which he had worked so hard to prepare for, was being diminished, and that his input was no longer valued. His growing isolation within the family dynamic became a symbol of the deeper divides that were forming not just within Daystar, but also within the Lamb family itself. The rise of Doug Weiss within Daystar also had a profound impact on the network's spiritual direction. While he was highly respected as a counselor and marriage therapist, there were growing concerns that his approach to ministry was too focused on emotional well-being and not enough on the gospel message. His programming, which emphasized emotional restoration and personal healing, began to overshadow the more traditional aspects of Daystar's ministry, such as evangelistic preaching and worship services. For some, this shift felt like a betrayal of the core values that Daystar had once stood for. As Doug's role expanded, so did the scrutiny. Many insiders within Daystar and the Christian media community began to question whether his focus on emotional healing was genuinely in line with Daystar's mission, or if it was a means of consolidating power. His growing influence over content and the way the network was portrayed to the public raised uncomfortable questions. Was Daystar still about spreading the gospel, or had it turned into a platform for Doug and Joni's personal agenda? Despite the criticisms, Doug continued to enjoy significant support from Joni, who saw him as a crucial partner in the next chapter of Daystar's story. Their marriage had given Doug access to a level of influence he could never have dreamed of before. His sudden prominence was difficult for some to accept, particularly those who had supported Marcus and Joni for years. The rapid changes to Daystar's leadership and programming left many viewers and donors uncertain about the future of the network. Some began to wonder whether the shift in leadership would cause Daystar to lose its original purpose and identity. The impact of Doug's ascent was not only felt by the Lamb family, but also within the broader Christian media community. Daystar had been a pioneer in the Christian television world, and many had looked to the network for its solid biblical teaching and evangelical outreach. Doug's more therapeutic approach to ministry, however, blurred the lines between traditional Christian teaching and secular counseling, leaving many supporters feeling conflicted. Through it all, Doug continued to rise in influence. His teachings on emotional health, marriage, and relationships began to resonate with a large portion of Daystar's audience. For many, his advice was a breath of fresh air, offering practical wisdom and hope for personal healing. However, for others, Doug's rapid rise and the changes within the ministry left them questioning the integrity of Daystar's mission. They wondered if it had lost its way in the pursuit of a more secular, therapy-driven approach. Doug's impact on Daystar, both positive and negative, highlighted the challenges many ministries face when leadership changes hands. It was clear that the transition of power within the Lamb family was not just a personal issue. It was a ministry issue that affected the direction of one of the largest Christian media empires in the world. Doug's rise to prominence would continue to shape the future of Daystar, and the tension between preserving the legacy of Marcus Lamb and embracing new ideas was far from resolved. The tension within the Lamb family, particularly the marginalization of Jonathan Lamb, is a deeply complex and emotionally charged issue that has cast a long shadow over the future of Daystar, the global Christian television network that Marcus and Joni Lamb built together. For years, Daystar was seen as the epitome of family values, with the Lamb family at its core. However, as time passed, the lines between personal relationships and professional responsibilities began to blur, resulting in fractures that seemed impossible to mend. Jonathan Lamb, the son of Marcus and Joni, had been preparing for years to take over the reins of Daystar. He had worked alongside his father, learning the intricacies of running the network and carrying the same passion for spreading the gospel that Marcus had championed. Marcus's vision for Daystar was to make it a beacon of Christian faith, a platform where believers from all over the world could come together, learn, and be inspired. Jonathan was always seen as the natural heir to that vision. For much of his life, Jonathan was a figurehead in the ministry's day-to-day operations. He had been groomed to lead, his father's right-hand man, and many insiders believed that the transition of leadership to Jonathan would be a seamless one after Marcus's passing. He had the experience, the passion, and the relationships necessary to take the helm of such a large and influential ministry. However, when Marcus passed away unexpectedly, the dynamic within the Lamb family and Daystar shifted dramatically. What many had anticipated as a smooth succession process turned into a bitter and complicated battle for control. Joni Lamb, Marcus's widow, immediately stepped into a leadership role at Daystar, but her leadership style quickly became a point of contention. Joni, who had always been a strong figure behind the scenes, found herself facing the pressure of not only mourning her husband's death, but also holding together the sprawling media empire that he had spent years building. She was thrust into the spotlight and had to make decisions that were in line with Marcus's vision, while also dealing with the demands of running a multi-million-dollar network. But as Joni took charge, the very foundation of Daystar, which had been built on trust and unity, began to fracture. For Jonathan, this shift was devastating. As a son, he had always been close to his father, working side by side with him in the ministry. He had seen himself as the natural successor, the one who would continue Marcus's legacy. But instead of being handed the reins to lead Daystar as he had expected, Jonathan found himself increasingly sidelined. His contributions were downplayed, and decisions that should have been made together as a family were being made solely by Joni, often without consulting Jonathan or the rest of the family. The frustration for Jonathan grew as he watched Joni make significant decisions about the direction of Daystar without his input. His once close relationship with his mother seemed to deteriorate as they clashed over leadership styles and the future of the ministry. For Jonathan, this wasn't just about a business decision. It was personal. He had spent years preparing for this role, and now, with Joni at the helm, he felt as though his efforts were being disregarded. He was no longer just a son looking to honor his father's legacy, but someone fighting for his rightful place in the ministry that had been his life's work. But the tension wasn't limited to just professional disagreements. The Lamb family dynamic, which had once been built on trust, love, and unity, began to unravel as personal rifts deepened. Jonathan wasn't just upset about his exclusion from Daystar's leadership. He was also hurt by how the decisions were being made. Joni's leadership, which some described as authoritative, seemed to distance her from the rest of the family, including Jonathan. The divide between mother and son grew wider as Jonathan voiced his concerns and frustrations, but Joni's responses were often dismissive. This growing rift became more apparent to Daystar's staff and audience as well. Behind the scenes, the tension between Jonathan and Joni became a topic of conversation. There were rumors of Jonathan's frustrations spilling over into his public appearances, where he seemed increasingly distant and disconnected from the direction of the network. For many who had supported the Lamb family for years, seeing the family's unity unravel was painful. They had always admired the Lambs for their close-knit family values and their commitment to ministry, but now it seemed as though personal ambitions and power struggles were taking precedence over the mission of Daystar. Joni's remarriage to Doug Weiss, a longtime family friend and Christian counselor, added more fuel to the fire. The couple's rapid rise to power within Daystar raised many eyebrows. Doug's influence within the network grew quickly, and many questioned whether his role was appropriate, given his relatively recent involvement with the Lamb family. For Jonathan, this was a tipping point. Not only did he feel excluded from the ministry's leadership, but now it seemed that the family's personal decisions were interfering with the future of the ministry. Doug's increasing prominence within Daystar, particularly on air, seemed to overshadow Jonathan's role, further deepening the divide. It wasn't just the growing influence of Doug Weiss that alienated Jonathan. It was the way the entire network seemed to be moving in a direction that was at odds with the values and principles Marcus had established. While Joni and Doug focused on counseling and emotional healing programming, Jonathan felt that Daystar's original mission was being compromised. For him, it wasn't just about leadership. It was about preserving the integrity and legacy of Daystar as a platform for gospel preaching, not a media empire built on emotional therapy and self-help. The frustration turned to public outcry as Jonathan began to speak out about the changes within the ministry. In interviews, he expressed his concerns about how the leadership transition was handled and how his voice had been marginalized. The situation became even more complicated as Jonathan's relationship with Joni deteriorated. He accused her of prioritizing her own ambitions and power over the values Marcus had instilled in the ministry. As the public feud between Jonathan and Joni escalated, Daystar's loyal viewers and supporters were left to pick sides. Some supported Jonathan, believing that he had been unfairly treated and that he should have been the one to take over the network. Others defended Joni, arguing that she was simply doing what was necessary to move the ministry forward in the wake of Marcus's death. The family split had now spilled over into the public eye, and the once unified voice of Daystar was fractured. The family tensions also had a ripple effect on the ministry's financial situation. As Jonathan's influence waned, so did his involvement in key decisions about Daystar's funding and donor relationships. Joni's increasing control over the network's finances raised questions among donors and staff about the transparency of financial decisions. Were the funds being used to support the ministry's spiritual goals? Or were they being funneled into maintaining a power structure that benefited a few? Rumors circulated about the management of Daystar's funds, further eroding trust among those who had supported the network for years. Behind all of this, there was a sense of sadness and betrayal. Jonathan's departure from the forefront of Daystar's leadership represented the breaking of a family bond, and it seemed to symbolize the end of an era for the ministry. For many, it was hard to imagine Daystar continuing without the Lamb family at the helm. Yet, as the personal struggles of Joni and Jonathan played out, it became clear that the future of Daystar would depend on how the family reconciled. Or if they could ever reconcile, after such a deep division. The future of Daystar Television Network is at a crossroads. Once an unshakable pillar in Christian media, Daystar, founded by Marcus and Joni Lamb, has become a battleground of family tensions, leadership struggles, and shifting priorities. What was once seen as a symbol of unity and faith is now caught in the midst of controversy, as the legacy of the Lamb family is being challenged by internal conflict and questions about the direction of the ministry. For decades, Daystar was a beacon of hope and inspiration for millions of viewers worldwide. The Lamb family, particularly Marcus and Joni, were seen as the heart and soul of the network. Their partnership, both in marriage and ministry, created a powerful platform for preaching the gospel and reaching audiences with messages of faith. Together, they built a global media empire that included television broadcasts, outreach programs, and charitable endeavor. For many, Daystar was not just a network, it was a family that embodied the Christian values of love, unity, and service to others. However, with Marcus's sudden passing, the foundation of Daystar began to shift. The void left by Marcus was profound, and while Joni stepped forward to lead the network, her leadership was not without its challenges. Marcus had been the visionary of Daystar, the one who charted its course and steered it through turbulent waters. His sudden death left a gap that no one could have fully prepared for, especially not Joni. Though she had been a constant presence behind the scenes, managing the operations and supporting her husband's vision, taking the reins of the network on her own was a monumental shift that few expected to unfold as it did. The transition of leadership was complicated by several factors. First, Joni's leadership style began to take center stage, and many began to notice a shift in the network's tone and direction. Whereas Marcus had been known for his inclusive and family-oriented leadership, Joni's approach was more centralized, and decisions that once involved the family as a whole were now being made from her office alone. This shift did not sit well with everyone, especially within the family. Jonathan Lamb, Marcus and Joni's son, had been groomed for years to take on a leadership role within Daystar. He had been learning the ropes of the ministry alongside his father, and many saw him as the natural successor to Marcus. However, as Joni began to consolidate power, Jonathan found himself increasingly sidelined. What had once been a family-run ministry seemed to be turning into something else, something that didn't feel as inclusive or collaborative. Jonathan's frustrations grew as he felt excluded from key decisions, and the rift between him and his mother became more public. The growing divide within the family wasn't just a business issue. It was deeply personal. Jonathan had always seen himself as carrying on his father's legacy, but Joni's ascension to the top and her increasing control over Daystar's direction left him feeling betrayed. The emotional toll of this separation was evident, and it played out in both the public eye and behind closed doors. For Jonathan, the network that had once been a place of family unity and shared purpose had become a battleground of competing interests, leaving him uncertain of his future role in the ministry.